Hello and welcome back to our final GraphQL Fireside chat. My name is Sarah Renaud with This.Labs. This event has been part of a 4-part online series hosted with Hasura. Each week we will focus on GraphQL and a different front-end framework. This week is all about GraphQL and Relay. Our sponsors today are This.Labs and Hasura. This.Labs are your partners in modern digital transformation. We specialize in mentorship, consulting, training, staff augmentation for enterprise organizations. Find out more at this.labs.com or send us an email at hi@this.co. Hasura is an open source engine that connects to your databases and microservices and auto-generates a production-ready GraphQL backend. You can read more about Hasura at hasura.io. Although this is our last Fireside chat in this 4-part series, we will return October 27th with a brand new set of topics to discuss. Stay tuned for more information at graphql-meetup.com. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers for today's Fireside chat. Tanmai Gopal, founder of Hasura, Sean Grove, co-founder at OneGraph, Jesse Martin, developer relations at GraphCMS, and Joe Savona, software engineer at Facebook. Welcome, everybody.
Hey, everyone.
With that, I will hand things off to Tanmai.
Thank you, Sarah. Hey, everybody. I'm sure you missed me a lot over the last week. And so with that, we'll get started with this session. I'm super happy to be with everyone here, talking a little bit about GraphQL and Relay. This is personally going to be an extremely interesting conversation for me because it is only very recently that my mind has been by Relay. And in that context, maybe to kick things off, would love to do a quick round of introductions, everybody, maybe starting with Jesse. And just a quick intro, and also where are you dialing in from?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jesse, developer relations and solutions architecture at GraphCMS. We are a GraphQL native headless CMS and like GraphQL only headless CMS. So if GraphQL is your thing, definitely check it out. I am calling from southern Germany.
Awesome. And have you been using Relay? Did you use Relay a long time ago? Do you use Relay now? What's the Relay story?
Yeah, as developer relations, you have to try every piece of technology out there because like you just rotate around all day long. But I used it when it first came out and was playing around with it, and I took a break from it and then recently kind of reintroduced to it, especially after a whole bunch of changes were announced at some recent conference. And I was looking at it again and just been also really mind blown by how elegant the API is. And I've just really enjoyed just seeing how it functions as kind of a standardization of functionality between GraphQL APIs. And I'm really excited to talk about it some more tonight and some of the features inside there.
Sounds awesome. Joe?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for hosting. So I'm Joe, dialing in from New York City. And so I've been at Facebook for about 6 years now and working on Relay for a good percentage of that time. So took a break at some point, worked on some other projects, and came back to the team about 2 years ago, and have been working on a lot of the new features for Relay. So yeah, happy to be here.
Awesome. Sean?
Calling in from San Francisco, and only started using Relay probably mid last year. And I think probably like a lot of people, I was very skeptical. My co-founder at OneGraph is Daniel Woelfel, and he was on the Relay team beforehand, and he pushed it very hard. And because of that, I was like, no, you drank the Kool-Aid. It can't be that good. And I regret taking so long to get into Relay. So excited to talk about it and kind of my coming to see the light.
And what finally convinced you to try Relay?
So actually, I have primarily used it from the ReasonML language, and so I wanted a very good, safe way of accessing an API. And a friend of mine, Gabriel Nordborn, was working on the bindings, and he kept pushing me to try it out. And as I was trying it out, basically as a favor to him, I think, I kind of kept fighting it. And what I found was every time I was fighting Relay, it was because I was actually approaching a problem incorrectly. And once I learned to kind of relax and stop fighting it, suddenly everything made a lot more sense. Not only about Relay, but also about React and a lot of kind of app composition as well.
Got it. No, that makes sense, and we're going to dive into that. And just from on my end, I'm Tanmai. I've at Hasura we've just started experimenting with relays. So we've added relay support, preliminary relay support in our last release, and in our next release we'll be augmenting that, making that much more kind of easier to use, and especially having it work with multiple services, which is an interesting challenge. So that's kind of been my excuse to kind of start trying relay out, and then of course understanding relay, where when Sean and Gabriel helped out a lot, and they have some incredible blog posts that you should definitely check out if you're kind of looking at getting into relay. And I very recently then had kind of my mind blown thinking about relay and thinking about the way it works, and then kind of getting this sense that the way that we're using GraphQL on the client is just probably all wrong. But more about that later. So I think maybe to kind of start things off would be amazing context to kind of understand from you, Joe, how kind of Relay and GraphQL have evolved over the years, and kind of where it was before and where it is now, and what are kind of the big changes that have happened in Relay over let's say in the latest release this year and early last year.
Sure. Yeah, that's a lot to cover, so I will try to. It's many years of things, so I'll try to go briefly, and then feel free to maybe you can ask follow-ups on more things. But yeah, I think so. For those who haven't followed the history of GraphQL, it really was kind of created when we were starting to build the native version of the Facebook app, and we needed a way to get data for the app, right? And the sort of typical thing would be to create like a REST endpoint that's a bespoke REST endpoint that has exactly the data that you need, because you don't want to overfetch data, and so the idea of like, okay, how do we? But we're gonna have different app versions, and we don't want to have lots of different versions of the REST endpoint. All the problems that we know that GraphQL solves, and we're facing the team, and that's kind of the motivation for creating GraphQL. And actually, around the same time, we were creating an internal framework that was for loading data for React apps, and the idea was to kind of pair routing with data loading. And so that you're going to go to a certain route. That route needs data. What if you could start loading the code and the data for that route in parallel? And how would you do that? And so GraphQL was kind of like evolving at the same time. And so the framework kind of evolved to, and this is kind of a precursor before it was even called. It was actually called Delight internally. Was the working name, and that's like an evolution of an internal routing framework and anyway, we skipped some letters and ended up at Delight, and then of course that was a terrible name, so we renamed it to Relay for open source. Yeah, but that was kind of the actual motivation. Was really about like making it possible to load data and code in parallel for review, and that was like really it. And then I think that kind of got paired with the React philosophy of component-oriented development, where instead of focusing on technologies, you focus on the unit of composition, a single component, and kind of build a reason locally. And so that's where GraphQL Fragments, really came in. And so we kind of embraced Fragments early. And so I think a lot of the sort of evolution from there has just been about looking at the kind of common patterns that we see in applications. And, we try to use Relay. We're using Relay in the new Facebook.com, like we've used it in, some of our most most sophisticated products, certainly, sophisticated, user interfaces. And so that kind of, forces us to kind of see lots of different use cases and address those. And so, things like pagination, object identity, things like that have kind of been things that we've been thinking about for a long time and trying to address. So that's like a little bit up to where we are, at least to answer.
Brief history.
Yeah, brief history.
Makes sense. When I think like the story of kind of GraphQL evolving with in tandem with I think this native iOS app that was happening, right? Was the first kind of few ways that GraphQL was being used in the iOS app, which was the first place where it was used. Was that in kind of like with a relay style thing, or that was just like with the vanilla HTTP client? Like it was just like switching out the REST things, replacing the body, and just making GraphQL call.
I'm not 100% sure of the details there, but one thing that is interesting is that the GraphQL syntax, originally the GraphQL syntax actually like didn't exist. It was like, well, or in particular, the GraphQL syntax wasn't something that developers actually wrote initially internally. You'd actually write like a builder type API, and then the text format was just what was sent to the server. And then we actually went from there to persisting the text on the server, so the client was actually only sending an ID. And it was only later that we actually changed to having developers actually write the GraphQL syntax.
How soon did you change from sending the text from the client to actually persisting that query? Was it a very early on change, or was it?
Yeah, I'm really not sure exactly when in the evolution that happened, but I know it was like reasonably early, but I'm not sure exactly when. Yeah.
And Relay came after the whole business of like people starting to write their own GraphQL queries. Relay came after that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not, like, honestly don't, I joined in 2014, so I don't I don't remember the exact details of like when that happened.
Got it. No, I was just curious. But no, that's super interesting. And I think like and kind of how has Relay changed in these kind of two major releases, right? That like the first version of Relay and the new version of Relay, like what are the big kind of changes philosophically that have happened that Relay had first, and then the new version?
Yeah. So the sort of initial version of Relay was, it was, I don't know. I think the best analogy I can come up with is like Relay we call it Relay Classic. It's the old version. That was the initial version open source. Is sort of like a dynamic language that's with an interpreter, maybe. And Relay Modern is sort of the foundation that we're on now, and that's sort of more like a static language with a ahead of time compiler. I think is like the rough analogy. Not quite to that point, but actually, I think Java is like a perfect analogy. There's an ahead of time optimization, but you still are actually interpreting bytecode at runtime. It's probably the closest. So Classic, I think that the distinguishing feature was that we basically did query manipulation at runtime. And so that enabled a bunch of really advanced, kind of advanced, or I guess really what I should say is magical kind of functionality, where we could do things like take a query, walk it against, diff it against the store, and say, oh, like you need these 3 fields, but you already have 2, so we're just going to fetch the one that's missing. Or even say like, oh, okay, everything diffed out, in which case we don't even have to go to the server. The thing is that wasn't always like predictable. Sometimes you'd end up with like you're fetching a list and you're missing one item on one field on each item, and so you send like 100 queries, one per item, just each asking for a little field, and things like that. And so the kind of upside was when those heuristics like worked really well. It meant like I think developers really enjoyed the experience that they got from that. But it was also a lot harder to kind of build a mental model of what's going to happen at any particular point, right? You're like, am I going to fetch this whole query? Am I going to fetch part of it? What happens if I have some stale data in the cache and it gets diffed out? Well, I have to now I've got to try and prevent that. And it just meant that developers ended up having to do a lot more to kind of work around this sort of magic that was built in. And at the same time, that magic was not free, right? The query manipulation at runtime was not free. And it meant that we then had to print the actual text of the query and upload it, because the queries were dynamic. You couldn't actually persist a query that was dynamically generated, right? And so the big idea with Relay Modern was move a lot of that work of constructing queries to build time, and do a lot of optimization at build time. And so and with the idea that all this kind of magic that we were getting by doing query manipulation at runtime was actually not leading to the best developer experience. And so by moving to build time, we could get performance wins by moving optimization, by moving work out of runtime, but also actually end up with a kind of a more predictable developer behavior at runtime and a better developer experience and mental model, like easier to have a mental model of the system.
Got it. And the cost that you had to pay, and the cost of that was that there was an additional kind of step while developing. That's the okay.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yep.
Makes sense. And sorry, you were saying?
No, go ahead. No, please. Sorry.
No, and then and so kind of like looking kind of looking at kind of how relays evolved. What has kind of been what has kind of been hard for like Jesse, considering that you kind of looked at relay a while back and then started looking at relay recently. What were kind of the things that when your first impressions when you were looking at relay and you were thinking about kind of using it or not using it, what was kind of going through your mind? What did you feel were things that you liked, things that you didn't like, things that seemed like they were kind of barriers for you to start using relay?
Yeah, I think because they were both so new at the same time and they kind of hit the market at the same time, getting my mind around GraphQL at the same time as Relay was almost like an overload. Like it was two sort of fundamentally new concepts to app development and composition. And so for me, I think it was kind of like, okay, Relay must be next level, like I'll start with GraphQL and then Relay is going to be like this thing that must be overly complex and solving overly complex problems that I have. And I think it doesn't take very long to implement any application in GraphQL before you realize, oh yeah, that's why Relay exists. It's solving these very common patterns that actually are annoying to write by hand or annoying to solve on your own. And there was a little bit, I guess maybe some noise in the community that was kind of like Relay was a complex tool, or Relay was kind of like killing a canary with a cannon kind of approach. And it was like, well, it's not exactly, I think shied away some people that were more on the implementation side, or I'm not the most technically deep person. I'm more of the like implementing and guiding customers how to use something. And it's like, well, you can do that with fetch with GraphQL because it's so powerful. But no, so I think that's what had pushed me away a little bit. But then once you actually realize kind of the key, I think for me, where Relay really shines is in the composition area, where you're able to say, like you were saying earlier, fragments, being able, it's not just about drying up your code. It's about actually componentizing your code. Like being able to say, my component's asking for the code that it wants, not just the client's asking for the code, but this individual thing is able to say, the one data fetch is powerful, but if I have to drill down all of the props, 40 components deep, this is defeating the purpose. And so being able to use Relay as that driver for creating the component structure was, I think, really what I saw the most. And I mean, GraphCMS has had Relay support like out of the box, and I hadn't really even just touched it. And then it was only probably about a month or so ago where I was like, oh, this is going to be the year of Relay, because this is actually really solving a lot of really powerful problems.
Right. Yeah. No, but I completely concur. I remember the first time I looked at GraphQL and Relay, and was like many, many years ago. And I was like, what is even happening? What is like, close this tab, right? And then just like
open
came back to it.
tab.
Come back to it many years later, right? Because GraphQL is a pretty complex specification. It's not like there's like by the time there are nuances into it and it is pretty complex. And then you have like this thing called Relay, and then it's just it's too new, and there's too much going on. And I think that kind of like what we've seen with that GraphQL and Relay adoption really speaks to kind of these two acts of this importance of API integration, right? There's kind of been this one part that GraphQL has solved that is kind of independent almost of data fetching. It's almost like the part that doesn't really care about the whole performance and developer experience benefit of optimizing your application development experience and optimizing your application to do data fetching. It almost has nothing to do with that. There's one part of GraphQL which is just all about API integration convenience and API exploration, right? Which is just the aspect of being able to say, oh, I can autocomplete my API and I can see what I have in my API. And that's enough. That's almost as if like that's one whole that's one whole set of things that's enough for people to use GraphQL for, to say, I'm just going to take my vanilla REST stuff and replace it with GraphQL just because I actually have like this first class way of browsing the API, which I did not have with REST, without a lot of like hand-built tooling around REST, right? And that's kind of one act. And then there's kind of this second thing which happens when you realize, when you start building with GraphQL and you start building applications with GraphQL, that you realize that you have these common problems, or you realize that you have these kind of other issues, that you want to kind of co-locate components and data, right? Or you want to integrate the way data fetching works with the way routing is done, for example, what Joe was talking about, right? And then you kind of start realizing that you need like a sophisticated client on the client side to kind of be able to handle some of these problems, right? Which we'll get into. But yeah, it's definitely been like a two-step journey for me, right? Like that one, if it was all one step, it is way too much. Even as a two-step journey, it's quite a bit to take in. But it's definitely kind of been like that. How's that experience been for you, Sean? From kind of what was kind of the benefits that you started seeing, before and after Relay?
Yeah, so I came into GraphQL from the ClojureScript side of things. So Relay wasn't really on my radar. So I was much more interested in just being able to kind of explore and join different data together and whatnot.
Right.
I think that the challenge with Relay is actually that most of its discoveries are counterintuitive. So there's this saying of like, whenever you're flying like a small propeller plane and it's stalling, you don't need anyone to give you any advice to pull back on the throttle, right? Everyone does that. That's very intuitive. But what you need is like someone who has experience to tell you, you actually have to like lean into it. You have to like dive into the stall in order to regain speed. And having someone who can give you that counterintuitive advice is very valuable. But if someone just tells you it, you're like, no, that's not going to work. And I think a lot of the challenges with Relay, for example, with the connection spec, was very counterintuitive. You saw this thing and you thought, why would I want that? Right? Like you're desperately pulling back on the throttle, trying to paginate. And you're like, no, I don't want this edges and nodes thing. This is crazy. And it wasn't until, you implement pagination for the 10th time and you start to see parts of the connection spec starting to emerge in your own patterns. And you realize, wait a second, that might be something to look into. And I think maybe part of the challenge for Relay has been that maybe two-sided. One is inside of Facebook, they were also learning how to do things properly initially with Relay. And they were maybe 6 to 12 to 18 months ahead of everyone else in terms of like how to actually approach these problems. And if you couple that with, they're still trying to figure out how to solve these problems well. They've learned a lot, but they're maybe not necessarily ready to communicate it very broadly. Means that you're going to get a lot of people who will look at the results.
Is it just me, or is...
No, it's frozen.
Oops. Sean? Is that a virtual background behind Sean?
It is a virtual background.
Yeah, but it's...
I wouldn't be surprised if he could play the piano like that. But,
yeah, just like Sean, just like grand pianoing and then relaying. But I think kind of like, yeah, maybe to kind of continue from where kind of Sean was leaving off, just to talk about like those kind of some of these ideas and like key kind of things or concepts that Relay introduces, right, or maybe adds on top of vanilla GraphQL, right, would be kind of interesting to think about. Joe, do you have like what would you say are like the kind of key things that Relay makes you think about on top of kind of like your usual vanilla simple GraphQL spec?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think really we've like really always approached Relay from the beginning as like, I mean, I guess like one way to think of it is like, what should a GraphQL client be, but also a little bit like, this is like it's really like a data management library. It's a library for caching and managing and fetching and updating data, right? And so when you think about data systems, you think about things like identity, like primary keys in databases, or having some other, canonical identifier for a logical entity, right? Whether you have whether you model, whether you're using like purely functional programming where there's multiple copies, but still you have some conceptual identity for like this person, or this account, things like that, right? So we have sort of on layer on top of GraphQL this notion of object identity via the node interface and the ID field. And then kind of coupled with that is the notion of fetchability, right? So there's identity, which is like a logical thing that has some identity, and then there's also fetchability, which is like often related to that, but it can be distinct, right? You can have an entity that is sort of ephemeral, and like maybe you can't independently fetch it, but it does sort of exist and can be at least be loaded. So something like often like algorithmically ranked feeds are sort of ephemeral, right? Like if you hit it again, you're going to get different data. So it's not like a distinct logical identity, but you can still fetch that. And so that's a fetchable entity. And then, yeah, as Sean mentioned, pagination, right, which is just like something that comes up, again and again, because most apps are basically just lists of lists. So, yeah, pagination tends to come up. And then I guess the last maybe piece is the idea of co-location, where GraphQL has the notion of fragments, and what Relay does to kind of expand a bit on that is that when we're used to writing React components, or if you're working with a different view framework, whatever your sort of component-like abstraction unit is, those are often parameterizable via in React via props, right? But if you're going to have a photo component that needs to fetch a photo, well, the photo probably has a configurable size, and so you want the fragment to have a configurable size, and you might want to have two different photos on the page that are different sizes, and so that can't be just one global query variable. How do you handle that? Well, really, you want fragments to be parameterizable as well, and so Relay kind of augments fragments and with the ability to have them take parameters as well. In a way that compiles to standard GraphQL. So that's kind of one extra piece, though they don't have to use, but it's an optional thing.
You're silent. Tanmai, you're silent.
Thank you. Sorry. And so in kinds of separating that in terms of things that Relay needs the GraphQL API to provide versus what the Relay client itself can provide automatically, right? There's identity. There's kind of this notion of every entity in every piece of data that you fetch having kind of this global identity, or having like a global unique, like an object identity, right? Which then makes it possible to fetch portions of that object or that entire object on demand wherever you need it, right? And that's kind of one piece, and so that's kind of one kind of thing that becomes like a mandate for the GraphQL API to have. The second thing that you mentioned was fetchability. What did you? I'm not sure I understood that well. What did you mean by when you said like the fetchability as an independent idea from the notion of global object identity?
Yeah. So fetchability is just the idea that like some entity, an entity can be fetched, and so for example, like the example I gave of like an algorithmically ranked feed, right? So for example, like my Facebook feed, right? Like in a way it has like a logical identity. It's like it's my feed, but it's not really like it's not actually representing any particular like entity that exists. Like it's this every view of it is completely ephemeral. It probably doesn't deserve an identity, but you may want to actually make that fetchable. And it's more of a concept than like actually like an implementation detail. But I do think it's something that it's like useful to think about as a concept when you're thinking about data and graphs. But I think in terms of like the actual thing that Relay really requires a server to provide, the single biggest one is the object identity. So we basically require that you have that objects that you want to have have cached with an identity, implement a node interface with an ID field that return like globally unique ID.
Right. And then that's kind of the one mandatory piece. And then And then things like, for example, for making things like pagination easy, there's the connection spec, which is kind of an optional add-on spec that you can have to help the client kind of automate some of these pagination tasks for you, right?
Yep,
And
exactly.
then when you talked about kind of the having to deal with fragments, when you start using fragments throughout your application, you realize that you need to kind of have fragments that take variables. And so those kinds of things are usually are all on the Relay client side. They're not required to go onto the server side, right?
Right, correct. Yeah.
Correct. Okay, got it. Awesome. So, so in that case, like if I have a GraphQL server today, the only thing I would need to do is to implement a node interface for my thingies in the graph, and then as long as each thingamy in the graph is addressable by a unique ID, and I can fetch that on demand, I can start effectively using the Relay client and its benefits.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, that's awesome. Sean,
I'd
any
be kind of
comments on? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I apologize for dropping out. It's 40 degrees here in California, and we're struggling with the heat. But I was going to say, given kind of Facebook's internal architecture and your ability to move very quickly with the teams and whatnot, what would be your recommendation for a company that already has a GraphQL API? Their IDs are not globally unique. They think, all right, well, we do want to bring in Relay. This seems amazing. How do we then overlay that kind of globally unique ID without kind of breaking all the existing deploys and whatnot? Is there a way to provide that migration?
Yeah, so we actually don't. We no longer require that the IDs be unique. You're actually able to provide a function at runtime to decide like what the cache identity of your objects are. But the sort of so you can actually do that. Basically, what Relay will do is sort of basically look at like there's a couple like heuristics for figuring out what the object identity to use is, but it's going to kind of fall back to like have we already figured out what the ID is? If not, we're going to call this function and sort of give you the type name and the record, and then you can kind of provide the ID. And so,
and would that also work with a node interface?
Yeah, and so like there's we have a default function that will basically just look at the ID field and say, and just assume that it's globally unique, right? But you could provide your own function that does something different. For example, like concatenate the type name and the local ID field, right? If you wanted to. The reason that really ultimately we're kind of optimizing for the case where we want to optimize for the case where like we don't want to do string concatenation on the client, right? We don't want to do this like all this extra string concatenation. So we'd rather have that be on the server. And just they take it, to get a global unique ID. But if you want to not have that, you can do the concatenation on the client in that function. The only kind of thing there is Relay compiler kind of uses the node interface to automatically fetch the ID field for you. So if you're not implementing that, then Relay compiler is not going to fetch that field for you. And then therefore you might get an object on the client that doesn't have the ID field, and now you don't know what to fetch. So by at least kind of conforming to the node interface and having an ID field, you're sort of at least effectively guaranteed that any record that you fetch will have the ID value, right? As long as the type has it, and then you can use that function to just concatenate the type name and ID and generate a unique ID. Right. So I think that makes it quite a bit easier than it was in earlier versions where you sort of had to have the node interface and it had to be globally unique. But now only that first restriction is there.
Right. And the node and this making sure that your GraphQL API provides a node query field or a node root field, that's kind of an optional thing.
Yeah, if you want to, so we have a feature that will kind of automatically generate a refetch query for a fragment. So let's say you have let's say you have a user type that implements node, right? You can write a fragment on user and write @refetchable and give it a query name, and we'll automatically generate a refetch query for you. But that's kind of relying on the fact that you have this node field in your schema, right?
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Sean, from kind of your experience building OneGraph, what are kind of some of the hardest bits and some of the bits that are not as hard as you would expect when kind of building out this kind of global object identity and node selector piece that is required across the various services that come into OneGraph?
So the largest challenge really is working around existing schemas, which is part of why I asked. right? So there's this assumption of, everyone has an ID. No one realizes that they should make it globally unique even within their API. But then whenever you say that actually this has to be universally, even across APIs, identifiable and addressable, is somewhat of a challenge. And so I was part of, we've seen APIs that have an ID field and also a node ID field, right? And so being able to kind of configure and whatnot. So one of the things that we've really hoped for is the ability to say, listen, we'll own up to making a mistake and not buying into Relay when we should have. And now we really want the Relay train. And we'll use the node ID or like the Relay node ID field from now on. If we could just configure that, then really, applying a global unique ID, like Joe mentions, is relatively easy, right? Like the server can say, this is how I'm going to generate these, addressable IDs for everyone. We don't have to do anything on the client or whatnot. Yes, I would say that actually, like the globally addressable IDs is generally not too difficult. The flip side of that, though, is maybe the fetchability. Is that even if you have an ID, it can sometimes be difficult to take that ID and then address a random API to get a specific entity, right? Like maybe they only have an endpoint that returns a list of objects or something like that. And then you have to like apply some additional work, but it's relatively rare. And I would say that the globally unique ID requirement is relatively minimal. It's not too difficult for us to implement.
Yep. And I think the only other situation where it's probably hard is when sometimes the object that you're addressing is only available when it's nested as a part of a parent object in the API that you're using. It might not be available at a granular, like as a directly kind. You might not be able to directly address that object, right?
But on the other hand, like if you can implement, if you concatenate a sufficient number of IDs, the parent object and the child object there, then what you do is you hide away a lot of that nastiness of that underlying API. And as long as you're not being too opaque with the cost of that, then that means that the people who are building on top of that, Relay compatible API, it's just so much more pleasant because suddenly, individual entities can be refetched regardless of how they're nested in some upstream crazy data store.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, that makes a lot of sense. I think to kind of maybe, two kind of elements that I think are worth kind of talking about, especially because they've been massively confusing for me when I think about GraphQL itself. The first is kind of when you think about using GraphQL for a page, right? And you have like this, you have kind of these, you have multiple ways that you can think about doing this API integration work for let's say a particular page that you're rendering, right? You can have this one global query that you make for your entire page, right? This one gigantic GraphQL query that goes and fetches everything. And then you have this other option, which is, and so the cost of that option is that everybody who's building a UI component, they all need to make sure that they go back to this parent component. They make sure that the GraphQL query has all of the data that they want, and that data is kind of passed down to them properly, right? That's kind of approach one. And then you have approach two, which is that everybody gets to make, everybody has their own UI components and they make their own GraphQL queries to get whatever they want, right? And so they don't coordinate to get this global data fetch. And it's very often I see, and I mean, the easiest way to kind of get started with GraphQL is the second approach, which is that I have this UI component, it's a part of a page, but I'm going to go make a GraphQL query. Who cares about the global GraphQL query? And that does kind of seem like it's a little bit like it's a little bit away from the benefit of GraphQL itself, right? Which is that the whole idea was to make this one query, which would fetch all of this data. And so you have kind of these two different ways of doing things, and it is confusing. And then kind of when you think about fragments, it kind of gives you this middle ground of saying, hey, all of the UI component developers, when they're kind of declaring their data dependencies, they don't actually need to use queries. They can just use fragments. And these fragments will automatically be composed into a full query if it needs to be. And if those pieces of the UI component need to be refetched on demand or at runtime or whatever, and they need to be refetchable, then that fragment can be made that fragment can kind of run almost by itself using this node field, right? And that kind of emerges the middle ground. Is that an accurate way to think about the kind of spectrum and where the trade-offs with GraphQL fragments and GraphQL without fragments lay? Is that the right mental model, Joe?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think it's the kind of two extremes that you gave were sort of, I think, true in a pre-GraphQL world as well, right? Like you could have fetch one just giant REST endpoint for your entire page at the top and then throw the data down, or you could just have lots of fine-grained, REST fetches, REST requests, at each component. And what GraphQL gives you, I think, like really the big thing that GraphQL gives you is like, you don't want to just keep doing one of those two approaches. Like the whole idea is that it lets you kind of get exactly what you said, the best of both of those, where you have, getting all of your data in one round trip is actually really nice, right? The like single giant custom bespoke REST endpoint, right? But that's like difficult to maintain, and you're going to end up just like leaving everything you've ever fetched in that endpoint because you don't know what version of the client somewhere depends upon a field, right? You're never going to delete anything. It's just purely additive. And then, but the advantage of like the local fetches is like, okay, like you just reason locally about exactly what I need, and you go and get it. And GraphQL, if you use fragments, if you do composition, gets you the ability to kind of combine those. So you write a fragment per component, compose those up. You can rely on things like Flow or TypeScript to sort of enforce that. My component renders like given some user, it asks for the name and the profile picture and renders a little card of the user, right? And so anyone who wants to render this, as long as they give me a reference, to the results of this fragment, right? And you can kind of use your type system to enforce that anyone who wants to render this must also have, fetched its data in their fragment, and it kind of forces the composition going up. And it's a really nice developer experience, I want to go in and I say, oh, let me put a little badge on this, on the profile photo. If some field is true, you just add the field, rerun the compiler, and ta-da, like the value's there, right? And you just touched one file.
Right.
So I'm totally on board with this. I love the fragment approach. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on the GQS approach of batching. So we're going to fire off lots and lots of queries, but we're going to do it in 200 millisecond intervals. And so any query that gets fired there just kind of gets concatenated together and sent over. And kind of like maybe what's the drawback or the disadvantage of doing something like that?
Yeah. So the disadvantage is round trips, right? It's I think that's really what the difficulty is. So if you have, for example, some root component fetches like a list of items in your newsfeed or list of friends or something like that. And then if like the child, each item in the list then has to go and issue another query. Sure, you can batch, together all the queries for each item, right, and do those. But that's another round trip for the server. And so, I think also this is a case where developers are often working on fast machines with like a fast network, great access to their database, because often you might even be running like a copy of your application environment on your laptop or on your dev server or something, right? And so we are just very much used to super low latency fast connections, and so round trips, sure, like work fast on my machine, and then that actually goes out to a real user on a phone, on a spotty network, something like that. And then you really start to see the problem. And so I think that's really the issue is the cost of round trips. I know obviously like things like HTTP2, maybe you can make some of that better. I've seen some like alternatives to GraphQL that are kind of, I forget what the name was. Like I've seen like some, I apologize to the library that I'm forgetting the name of, because it was a cool idea.
Vulkan or Vulkan?
Yeah, I think that sounds right. I didn't want to like missay it and like promote some random thing by accident. But like there's other ways to solve the round trip problem. But GraphQL is I think you can use GraphQL to solve that, and it's one of the most powerful things. One of the more powerful features it provides.
I think that one of the things also, and I missed this initially on my first time around with Relay, was actually the argument directives. So being able to use these fragments, but being able to say this fragment is going to be able to take in input arguments. And for some people in our audience, who maybe had the gateway drug of Gatsby for getting into GraphQL, like it's like the second question everybody has with Gatsby after they get it started and running is, oh, can I pass in variables or arguments to these components? And no, you can't. And I think that's one of the most powerful elements here, is because you can actually have these fine-grained composition elements and be able to say, okay, well, now this one also is able to take in some sort of a filter, some sort of an argument, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is kind of often overlooked is the sort of the structure that gives you. So if you're, it's not just about the initial load, right? Like your application is going to be on the screen, people are going to interact with it, and you want that to be, the application to remain responsive. And so if you're doing an approach that is, loading one query at the top, the sort of bespoke REST endpoint approach, and some other clients are kind of much more query-based, for example. So if you get an update to your data, if that has to sort of start from the top and then trickle down, well, you're going to re-render a lot more of your application every time there's an update. The sort of local query approach, the advantage there is that, like you can have like more fine-grained re-rendering, right? If you do sort of like a query to get the list of items and then query to get data about each item, then sure, if data about only one item changes, you'll just re-render that one item. But the downside is now you've got the waterfall, right, of like first fetch the list, then fetch the items. So with Relay, by embracing fragments, A, we solve the round trip problem, but B, we can kind of have the component and store subscriptions be very fine grained, so that only the components that actually have their data affected re-render. And so you kind of see, in general, you would like expect to see better application performance because you're not going to re-render, you're not going to like necessarily re-render the whole list just because, one field on one item, changed or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was one of the surprising things for me about Relay is like the fragment approach is really powerful, but it's so cross-cutting, right? Like yes, you can talk about like the benefits over here, but like we didn't even mention like refactoring and the ability to like just take a component and just drop it anywhere else, and like as long as you fill the types, it's fine, right? Like, and that's such a new experience, even coming from other GraphQL APIs and like enjoying all the other benefits of GraphQL. But then I was shocked like this kind of benefits, and then like you said, the optimizations you can do at the cache or the rendering layer. And so I feel like this is part of the difficulty in marketing Relay, is that it's very easy to go very deep down one of the holes, right? Like of the benefits. And it's kind of hard to and be like, oh, and also it does this, and also it does that.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I think also it's kind of I think what's also kind of important to understand is that Relay does do a few things in the way that it deals with fragments that kind of provide that level of convenience in dealing with fragments, right? Fragments by themselves are not necessarily super easy to deal with, right? When they're spread across your code base, it's kind of that some of the kind of magic that the Relay compiler is bringing in that makes it easy, right? Like what are those kind of key things that the Relay client does that makes using fragments easy, right? Joe.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, so with Relay, you basically just do ... fragment name, and the Relay compiler crawls your code base. You do have to configure Relay compiler, tell it like where your code is, but after that, it's going to crawl your code, find all the GraphQL tags in any any JavaScript file that you've included in the configuration, and kind of extract out all that GraphQL and compile it together. So
that's the reason why the fragment names need to be unique and have that kind of slightly weird naming structure.
Actually, so the naming structure is actually kind of a holdover from the migration from classic to modern, and we're actually in the process of removing that restriction, so you can just name fragments. We do think it's valuable to have the module name as like a prefix, just because it kind of helps, like you look at a fragment name, you kind of know where to go for that. Although there's some discussion about like making that an option that like maybe we can enable internally, but disable for the community. But anyway, aside from that, we do think it's valuable to at least have globally unique fragment names, because it means you can just quickly grep and like you're kind of guaranteed to find exactly what you're looking for
Right.
I think it's the kind of thing that, in a small code base, you're like, why does it matter?
Right.
And then in a big case, in a larger code base, you're like, yes, I want this. I want unique names for things so that I can just find them.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So basically, because the compiler can kind of find all the fragments, it can just figure out that ... foo, or like user profile fragment is defined over there, and kind of wire everything up for you. So you just get that, and that lets us do things like we're actually working on a Relay LSP implementation. So language server protocols. That's an IDE integration for Relay, which can also take advantage of those things to kind of let you do like ... And even though I haven't imported anything, we can just know what fragments are available, and so we can
give
make
you
that
like
work.
right. No, makes sense. The other piece that I'd quickly like to touch on is kind of maybe the is kind of also the story with client side state and Relay, and kind of what Relay's thoughts are today and where kind of it's headed. It's kind of been one of my pet peeves with GraphQL itself, which is that this idea of kind of caching on the client is not something everybody necessarily thought about, right? It was something that you thought about sometimes, but it's not something that you really thought about all the time. But then it seems that with GraphQL, it's kind of like this client-side caching has become this thing that you always think about, right? And it's nice because you get some of those benefits out of the box, but it's also a little inconvenient because you have to think about something that you previously did not think about, right? So kind of related to that challenge is this idea of because essentially caching is optimizing the way you are dealing with a local copy of the remote data that you have, right? It works well when you think about all of your client-side state as being a copy of the remote data that you or of the remote state that you need. But what does make it complicated is if you kind of have advanced or you have complex features that rely on client-side only state, right? And of course there were approaches like Redux before, which was this idea of maintaining a full client-side state tree and then having your remote data get absorbed into that a central store. You have like all of these different, even if you have like client-side only state, it gets absorbed into that local store that you have, right? And you treat that as an entity. But with GraphQL, that story has been a little bit harder, right? Do you extend that and add do you extend types and do you add your own fields to that to reflect client-side state? Do you use things like Redux? Do you use the context API? Do you just declare like things at the top level and then pass down props? What is kind of that? What is that story like, and how is that evolving with Relay? And what have experiences with what experience have other folks had as well? Maybe Joe, if you'd like to kick this off.
Yeah, I'm really curious what Jesse and Sean have kind of seen with this, but so I think in terms of what I can speak about, like what we're doing internally and what Relay supports, just really briefly. So internally, I think Relay supports client schema extensions. So you can kind of tell Relay kind of give it some schema extension files, like using the GraphQL SDL, like extend type and add fields. That lets you. So we use that internally a little bit for things like the kind of canonical example is like, has this person seen this entity in this session, right? Like sure, it's the kind of thing that often makes sense to the stores. Like you just want like this extra little flag on this object, right? And so client schema extensions are great for those like types of scenarios. For more like rich data, GraphQL can model a lot of things, but for example, like GraphQL doesn't have a notion of like a hash map like data structure or a set data structure, and so often for like an editor, like I imagine like a rich imagine like a design tool in the browser, right? Like maybe you have some very rich data structures that you want to represent, and it might actually make sense to represent them using some other data structure that like GraphQL can't necessarily represent. So for that, like for those types of things, like we still use like either like local state or Redux or Flux or variations thereof. But kind of combining them with Relay and maybe like kind of linking in linking to an object in the Relay store by its identity or something like that. But I'm kind of curious what others are doing for that.
Jesse, Sean?
You go ahead, Sean.
Sure. Yeah, I think we have a similar experience of like, well, me personally anyway. The extent has always been kind of like a is loading flag or has been saved or has been modified, kind of where it's very, very, very minor metadata. Sure, it's kind of ephemeral. I don't think I've ever extended like a full object even, right? So I created a full client-side object to represent some set of clients. I would probably just resorting that in JavaScript and managing it there, which elegant. I'm not sure, but yeah, I've never felt super comfortable with this attempt to try to model everything and put everything client side inside of GraphQL.
One pattern that we've done internally is basically having sort of client instances of server data. So for example, let's say you have, I don't know, like an event or something like that, right? And you want to go and create an event. Well, like we do have a server type that describes an event, right, and has fields on it. And so if you're like during the creation process, instead of having to store like the event data, even though it's like it doesn't exist on the server yet, we can kind of generate like a unique, client only ID for the event. And then actually store the event data in the store, in Relay store, right? And that way we can take advantage of like optimistic mutations and rollback and things like that. And then when you're ready, grab values out of that object and use it as the input to a mutation, for example. But that's like I think, or an editing would be another example, right? Like where you actually do have a server data, but you're going to edit it locally with optimistic updates. And then when you're ready, again, that's the input to a mutation. And so that pattern, I think, a lot of what you're doing is like CRUD, right? Like it's like you have objects, you're either creating them, you're editing them. And there, I think you can take advantage of the existing types to kind of represent that in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I think this is an instance where the vendor sugar comes into play, and especially how the GraphQL servers are implemented. Speaking as a GraphQL vendor, like this is partially what our bread and butter is handling these edge cases, or how do you handle these unique types, or modeling these specific cases of getting the kinds of keys you want to be caching on, or anything else. So this is exactly, I think Azure is probably in a similar bucket to this, where part of what we're building is then the ability to handle some of these edge cases into the platform that we're specifically selling. Sorry, my computer mouse is telling me that I'm freezing, but I think I'm back. So yeah, I think that's one of the cases where GraphQL is just so flexible and so free and open in a lot of these cases, that it is going to come down to a disciplined approach and how it's implemented. And either you have to kind of think about that ahead of time and say, okay, I'm going to do all this server side, and I'll just expose a couple of interfaces to be able to manage these manipulations or mutations, or I'm going to do it all client side, or I'm going to use a tool that's kind of thought through some of these cases. And so for us, I think for us, it's something that we're focusing specifically on handling those edge cases for our customers. But from what we're seeing, I mean, the Relay implementation that people are picking up, and when they're starting to get into it, it's basically already being a perfect match for the parts we're solving, and then the parts that Relay is solving. It's actually already, I think, fitting most of the needs that we've seen come up.
Yeah.
Or maybe Tanmai has some thoughts on it too.
No. I think that's fair. Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I was thinking about like why I don't immediately reach for extending the GraphQL schema, and I wonder if part of it has to do with you probably need to become pretty intimately familiar with interacting with the Relay cache and the store and whatnot, which particularly in a typed language can be pretty intricate. And so maybe the cost benefit trade-off for me just isn't quite there. So maybe it's not inherently a bad idea, like I was mentioning or hinting at earlier. Maybe it's just my personal experience and like the way that I'm approaching it. And I think that working with the Relay store in a type-safe way is supposed to be getting easier in the near future as well.
Yeah, so one pattern that we do a lot of for like updating local data is so we have APIs that kind of allow you to sort of imperatively modify the store and kind of like link two objects together, set a value of a field, things like that. But we also have the ability to just take a query, take a payload, and write that into the store, and that could be for local data as well. And so that sort of gives you type safety, because you can generate a flow type for the response payload of that query, and therefore, like, now the object that you provide will have to be typed to match that. So you kind of can't forget fields, and you have to get the field values, the right type, and things like that.
Makes sense. And I think like, I mean, we're kind of coming close to the end of the hour. But before we stop, maybe if we could spend a few minutes on what it would take for that Relay client experience to become available to other JavaScript frameworks and to other non-JavaScript environments. In fact, would be also interesting to understand what the GraphQL client experience for Android and iOS at Facebook is like. But folks who've, I mean, Sean, I know you have some experience with Reason and Relay, but would be kind of interesting to understand what the gaps there are, what it would take for us to get kind of the Relay client experience on other environments as well.
My suspicion is that it's largely an issue of marketing, of kind of learning resources, and of getting a lot of momentum. If I'm thinking about like which of the GraphQL clients do I invest in right now for the future, I'll probably go with the one that seems like it's already dominating. And I think Relay has done a really good job of solving the problems inside of Facebook, right? Like, that's their main customer is Facebook. And so they have been just laser focused on succeeding there, which is has produced a really amazing piece of software. But I think for someone outside of Facebook, it's probably relatively difficult to kind of get in to understand the benefits, to understand the counterintuitive decisions that have been made, and then to generate a kind of hype cycle behind that is so much. Like, you have a double-sided challenge, right? One is it's counterintuitive, and you need to also create hype around it. So even creating hype around something that's intuitive can be challenging. But I think other than that, like, from a technical standpoint and from a design point of view, it seems very solid to me. Any of the challenges that it's facing are probably pretty fundamental and like haven't been solved outside of Relay even. So for me, I think it largely comes down to probably having some kind of some better communication strategy. For us, we're looking forward to eventually switching over to Relay as well. I mean, already at this point. So, but that was like a consequence of banging our head against the wall for like a period of time, and having a ex-Relay team member on the founding team who was pushing us the entire time to do that.
Yep. That makes sense. Joe, your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So somebody in the Relay community actually got Relay and Angular working together. So one thing we've really made a point of with the design with Relay Modern is to really like have clean separation of, there's the compiler, there's Relay runtime, and then there's like what we kind of like the React Relay like integration layer, right? And so we try to keep like the Relay, the runtime has, I mean, it should not have any dependency on React, right? Like the idea is like everything that like may relate to React is kind of injected in as like is when you configure your environment. So for example, like you might want to do to have like all network publishes go through like React batched updates in order to get like all components to update in one batch. But like that can be actually provided as like an injected scheduler into Relay, as opposed to runtime having a React dependency. So it's kind of designed to make it possible that top layer, that like the React Relay integration layer, like you could have a Relay, like Angular Relay integration layer or Vue Relay. So really, that's a matter of like somebody recognizing the benefit of Relay and being interested in making it work with a different Vue framework and kind of doing the work to make that possible. But the core, like I don't imagine it would be all that difficult if you kind of understood that Vue framework and understood Relay to get it to work. Yeah. So in terms of Facebook and iOS, Facebook's use of GraphQL on Android and iOS. So we have an internal, native, GraphQL client that has been around for quite some time, and it is architecturally and sort of philosophically very aligned with Relay. So, we worked closely with that team when building Relay Modern. And so a lot of the kind of core concepts and things are shared. But that library has I would say probably more like Facebook specific things. Whereas like with Relay, because we've been open source, we've kind of tried to really keep as much as possible to be, more usable and open source and kind of avoid having overly Facebook specific decisions like baked into the core. So that like, no plans to open source that, as far as I'm aware. In terms of like Relay on non-JavaScript platforms, that would be an interesting one. I would love to see a GraphQL client that was inspired by the Relay ideas that worked on mobile. I'm not aware of one. Right, in terms of like, the strong focus on performance, ahead of time optimization,
Right.
really embracing fragments and co-location,
Right.
Things like that. But that's also a bit of a question too, if like the view frameworks are different, right? So I think it's Relay in many ways is like really designed for React, but really more generally for like component-oriented
Component-based UI, yeah.
as opposed to like the more traditional like imperative view frameworks. And obviously,
Right.
I'm not a mobile developer expert, right? So I'm not like completely up to speed, but I know that there have been advances with things like Swift UI and like
Right,
Compose on Android, right? That are kind of having a bit more of that style. We have our own internal frameworks, which are open source, Litho and Component Kit, that kind of bring the React component style to native. But I think the question would be like, what would you even start with in terms of the integration? Like, what's the single what view framework do you pick to integrate with for a mobile experience? So not clear what should happen there, but I would love to see somebody in the community, do something there. It'd be fun. I think there's a lot of room for innovation in the GraphQL client space, like, embracing some of the ideas that we've shown, but like with like a different take, and would love to see some experimentation there.
No, that's true, and I think it's definitely going to be one of the things that's required for GraphQL to become more mainstream. Is that is kind of these relay style ideas, making that more accessible across across the different environments that people have, and making that seem like it's less deeply coupled to just React, right? Even that I think is important. But yeah, that's.
But I guess actually, I was gonna say, I guess the counterpoint to that though is. Building relay compatible servers probably needs to be much more intuitive as well. Right now, like building GraphQL servers is very fiddly, very intricate. And so like building up the connection spec by hand every time is quite a bit of work.
Yep.
So if that side can be automated a bit more, then maybe adopting a relay client is a bit easier.
I was just going to add the one element of, I think from both the adoption of Relay and then expanding this to other frameworks is really going to come down to abstracting out the different parts that it does. Because even as Tanmai was suggesting as well, the first time you come into it, it just felt like this monolith of just so many things that it did. And you're like, well, is this all one massive thing, or are these multiple different benefits? And from the marketing side that Sean had mentioned too, like even if you're going on benefits versus features, there's still a ton of benefits because there's a whole ton of features. And if you abstracted these out to say, okay, this thing looks at all your code and pulls all the queries together into a single query. This thing is talking about making components and passing fragments, infinite levels deep, and being able to break out the framework into these different pieces, different services almost, then allows somebody to come in and attack it from one particular piece and say, okay, we're going to create the adaptation of the resolver technology in Java or whatever else. Right. We're going to take on one specific angle on it. And I think that's probably where I would see the adoption as well, because then it's easier to understand mentally. I'm coming at it for this encapsulated piece to understand how this behaves, not this huge thing, which is it's a full commitment to take that into your app. Yeah.
Yep.
So I guess as soon as Joe writes the marketing book on Relay, we should be good to go, right?
Yeah.
That's literally next on my list. How to
Relay up and running. It's like the formula, right?
I think I think I think there's kind of a bunch of cool new stuff that's happening in Relay as well, that Joe wanted to kind of I think mention. But as we're kind of closing out, maybe you can include it in your picks for us today, and kind of talk about some of these advanced Relay features. But as we kind of close this out, would love to just start off. Would love to just close this out with the picks that you folks have for tech, non-tech, GraphQL, Relay related, or otherwise that people should check out. Sean, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll stick close to the subject matter, and I'll recommend people check out the Reason Relay project. So Reason is a typed language that compiles to JavaScript, very readable JavaScript. But Reason Relay is a really great library that kind of models the Relay experience and guides you through it, and automates just a ton of the client side interactions with Relay. And it kind of makes it so that it's like bowling with bumper lanes. Like you can't do anything wrong. It's going to tell you very early on. And then in addition to that, the VS tooling for it is just fast. So you can just kind of select any GraphQL query. You can right click and say extract an entire component and generate a new module from it. So you can just kind of quickly slice and dice your application up just so nice. And there's a great Reason Stockholm talk where the author Gabriel Nordborn talks about it, and he's just very cash about the whole thing. He's like, oh, I'm just talking about Relay, and he's just using this tooling to do stuff that would take you hours and hours to do, to like extract and refactor and do everything. So definitely Reason Relay and the VS Code tooling that goes around it.
That sounds awesome. Jesse?
I'm gonna be very vendored in my pick. I'm gonna suggest people check out a free dev account on GraphCMS, because it does have built-in support for connection APIs, and it's got Relay abilities. So if you want to test out Relay and get started with it really, really quick, just boot up a free dev account on GraphCMS, get content in there with easy modeling, and start playing. I think it's still one of the fastest ways to model a functional GraphQL API out there, and it's a great way to get started.
That sounds awesome. Joe?
Sure. Yeah. So there's probably so many new features to talk about that I don't know if I can fit all of them. So I'm actually just gonna go slightly different direction and give a book recommendation. So Designing Data Intensive Applications by Martin Kleppmann is one of the best technical books I've ever read. And it's basically kind of, talks about a lot of the ideas of like things like logs, B trees, like how databases work, how distributed databases work, a lot of the kind of core kind of fundamental concepts about data in all manner, shape, or form. And I think that, if you're interested in working in the around GraphQL, you're probably interested in data, right? Especially if you're coming at it from the back end side. And so it's a great book to kind of really understand a lot of the core concepts around data management. And like that's sort of the theory behind them. So just a strong recommendation.
I remember many years ago coming across I think Martin had did a blog post around called "Turning the Database Inside Out."
Yes.
Yeah, and it was a very, very interesting talk. I mean, you kind of take that and then you're like, oh, I want to do this, and then you realize, okay, you can't do this because there's too much plumbing required. But you really do feel like doing it once.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that was exactly my question. And then when he wrote the book, I was super excited. It's a really great technical book, and very approachable. Like I don't, I was a CS major and forgot basically everything I ever learned during CS, and kind of relearned it from that book. But I don't think you need like a super technical background. Or at least not like a super deep background to understand it. So
that sounds awesome. All right, folks. Thank you so much for being here. And thanks, folks, for tuning in. We'll be publishing all of a bunch of the reference links and things that we talked about in the show notes, and links for you to find all of the folks on this chat, and how to get in touch with them. And so thank you so much for being here. Stay safe, stay sane, stay healthy, and thank you for tuning in. Bye, folks.
Cheers.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.